My name is Celeste Armand. I am 29 years old. And the Saturday evening my mother held my phone for 30 seconds, handed it back across the kitchen table, and told me that adults don't build careers on games. That was the evening I understood that the people closest to you will sometimes be the last ones capable of seeing what you are actually doing. She said it without setting down her coffee cup. That is the detail I remember most clearly. The cup stayed in her left hand the entire time, as though the conversation did not require her full attention. This is a game, Celeste. Adults don't build careers on games. My cousin Theo, who is 22 and had been visiting for the weekend from his university program in electrical engineering, laughed once from his chair at the end of the table. Not a mean laugh, exactly, more the laugh of someone who is relieved someone else has said the thing he was thinking. My father, who had been reading something on his own phone and had only been half present in the conversation, looked up long enough to say, "She needs stability, Adele," in the tone he used when he was agreeing with my mother, without committing to the argument himself. I picked up my phone from where she had set it, unlocked the screen, and navigated back to the beta dashboard. The session data from that afternoon was running well. Retention at the 7-day mark had climbed to 63%, which was 11 points above where it had been the previous month. I noted the figure, closed the dashboard, and put my phone in my jacket pocket. What none of them knew, what I had told no one in that house, or in that city, was that 3 days earlier, on a Wednesday morning, I had received an email from a product lead at a software company whose name would have been recognizable to everyone at that table. The email was 4 sentences. It asked whether I was available for a technical conversation the following week. It had been copied to 2 other addresses, both of which, when I looked them up, belonged to senior engineers on the company's platform infrastructure team. I had replied that I was available. I had not yet told anyone I had replied. I want to tell you what the app actually was because my mother's description of it, a game, was not entirely wrong and was not at all right, and the distance between those two things is where the last 2 years of my life had lived. The app was called Parcours. In French, the word means a route or a course or a path taken, the sequence of choices that gets a person from one place to another. I had chosen the name deliberately because that was what the app did. It mapped learning sequences. The specific problem I had set out to solve was this. People who wanted to acquire a technical skill, coding, data analysis, a specific software tool, a design methodology, were drowning in available material. There were courses, tutorials, documentation pages, YouTube channels, forum threads, structured programs, boot camps, self-directed paths. The material existed in abundance. What did not exist, reliably, was a way to assess where you currently were and identify the shortest honest route from that point to a specific functional capability. Most learning platforms solved this with a quiz at the beginning that sorted you into a tier and then delivered content in a linear sequence. The problem with linear sequences is that human knowledge gaps are not linear. A person can understand a moderately advanced concept and be genuinely confused by a foundational one they happen to skip. The quiz at the beginning does not find the skip. It finds the tier. Parcours used a different approach. Rather than a diagnostic quiz, it used a series of small applied tasks, not questions about concepts, but actual microtasks that required a user to do something with the knowledge. Based on which tasks a user completed fluently, which they completed slowly, and which they abandoned, the system built a gap map specific to that user and generated a learning sequence that addressed the actual gaps in the actual order that would make the subsequent material accessible. I had built the first version in 11 months, working in the 2 hours between 10 at night and midnight on weekdays and longer stretches on weekend mornings before the rest of the apartment was awake. I had a background in instructional design. I had spent 4 years at an e-learning company building curriculum for corporate training programs, which meant I understood both how adults learned and how the industry typically failed them. The technical build I had managed through a combination of a no-code backend platform, a freelance developer named Oren Blum, who I had found through a professional forum and who had built the gap mapping algorithm to my specifications over 6 months of back and forth, and approximately 300 hours of my own time learning enough about the underlying architecture to make intelligent decisions about it. The beta had launched quietly, 8 months before that Saturday evening in my parents' kitchen. I had seeded it through 2 professional communities I was part of and through a post on a forum for self-directed learners that had been picked up and reshared more than I had anticipated. By the end of the first month, I had 212 active users. By the end of the fourth month, I had 461, with a waitlist of an additional 308. I had not run a single paid advertisement. I had not pitched to any investor. I had not written a press release or contacted a journalist or posted about park hours on my personal social media accounts because I did not want the noise before the signal was stable. The signal, by the Saturday of my mother's kitchen table assessment, was stable. My mother's name is Adele Armand. She is 56 years old. She has worked in municipal administration for 28 years, in a department that manages permitting and zoning for a mid-sized city in Quebec, and she is exceptionally good at her job, methodical, detail-oriented, genuinely skilled at the kind of institutional patience that long-tenure public service requires. Her relationship to technology is functional. She uses what she needs to use, updates it when she is prompted to, and does not particularly distinguish between a productivity application and a mobile game beyond whether the thing she is looking at appears to require effort or appear to provide entertainment. When she held my phone and looked at the park hours interface, the task dashboard, the gap map visualization, the progress indicators, she saw something that looked, to her eye, like the kind of colorful interactive screen that her younger colleagues' children used on their tablets. She was not being cruel. She was reading a visual language she had not been taught. That is the part one had understood for a long time. Her dismissal was not malice. It was the specific limitation of someone whose entire professional frame had been built around institutional structures, degrees, certifications, seniority, the kind of credentials that arrived in envelopes from accredited bodies. A thing that existed on a phone and had been built by her daughter in the hours after dinner did not fit the frame. The frame did not bend. So the thing got classified as a hobby. My father, Remy Armand, operated on a slightly different logic. He was an engineer, civil, retired 4 years earlier from a firm where he had spent his career designing drainage systems for municipal infrastructure. He respected technical work. What he did not believe in was technical work without institutional backing. A product that had not been validated by a company, a university, a funding body, a recognizable structure of authority, that was not yet real to him. It was a prototype at best, a distraction at worst. His "she needs stability" was not indifference. It was a structural conclusion. The thing had not yet passed through the right gates, therefore, it was not yet the thing. Theo laughed because he was 22 and had not yet built anything, and laughing was easier than engaging. I understood all of this. I had understood it for the better part of 2 years. It did not make the kitchen table moment comfortable, but it meant I had not been waiting for their validation, which meant their withholding of it had no particular structural power over what I was doing. I went home that evening, opened my laptop, and drafted a reply to the engineering team's email confirming Wednesday at 10 a.m. The email had come from a product lead named Sebastian Fortin, who worked at a company I will call Meridian, a software platform in the professional development and enterprise learning space with approximately 4 million active organizational users across North America and Western Europe. Meridian's core product was a corporate training platform. Their market was mid to large enterprises that needed to deploy skills training at scale across distributed workforces. The gap that Meridian had spent 3 years trying to solve, according to what Sebastian would later tell me in the meeting, was exactly the gap park hours addressed. The diagnostic problem. Their platform delivered content well. It could not reliably tell a user or a manager which content a specific employee actually needed. The quiz and tier model they had been using produced completion rates that looked acceptable in reports and produced actual skill transfer that their enterprise clients were increasingly flagging as insufficient. Sebastian had found park hours through a post in a professional learning community. He had used the beta himself for 6 weeks before reaching out. The 2 engineers he had copied on the email, a woman named Dr. Priya Chandrasekaran, who led platform architecture, and a man named Felix Willett, who managed the API integration team, had also used the beta independently before the meeting. I did not know any of this when I walked into the meeting room on that Wednesday morning. I knew Sebastian's title and the 2 copied names. I had done what preparation I could, reviewed Meridian's public documentation, their enterprise product page, their 3 most recent press releases. I had brought a printed copy of the park hours methodology document that I had written for Oren's reference during the build, which was 41 pages and had never been shown to anyone outside of the 2 of us. The meeting lasted 6 hours and 14 minutes. We broke once, for 20 minutes, at the 2-hour mark. Sebastian ordered sandwiches that arrived at the 3-hour mark and were eaten at the table without the conversation stopping. I want to tell you what the 6 hours felt like, but the honest answer is that I was too focused on the technical questions to register much of an atmosphere. Dr. Chandrasekharan asked the kind of questions that required precise answers: how the gap mapping algorithm handled users who had inconsistent prior knowledge in different subdomains, what the data architecture looked like at scale beyond 5,000 concurrent users, how I had validated the task completion signals as reliable proxies for actual knowledge gaps rather than proxies for familiarity with the interface. I answered each one. Some answers were complete. 2 answers involved me describing work that was on the roadmap and had not yet been built, which I said plainly rather than obscuring. Felix Willett asked about API surface area, and I walked him through the documentation. At the 5-hour mark, Sebastian closed his notebook, which was the first time he had closed it in 5 hours, and said, "What we'd like to explore is an integration discussion." Formally. I asked what that meant structurally. He said it meant Meridian's business development team would reach out within 2 weeks to begin a conversation about terms. I said I would be available for that conversation. I drove home from the meeting in the early afternoon, stopped at a cafe I liked near my apartment, ordered a coffee, sat at a window table, and looked out at the street for approximately 15 minutes without doing anything in particular. Then I opened my laptop and responded to 12 beta user messages that had accumulated during the meeting. The business development conversation that followed took 11 weeks. I will not narrate it week by week because most of it was document review, questions from a lawyer named Annette Bouchard, who I retained on the recommendation of a colleague from my instructional design years, and a series of calls that moved between encouraging and inconclusive in patterns I had not been trained to read. Annette had been trained to read them. She told me at the end of the 7th week that Meridian was serious and that the shape of what they wanted was an acquisition of the Parkar's methodology and underlying technology, with a retention arrangement for me to lead the integration of the gap mapping system into their platform over an initial 2-year period. She told me the number they had put on the table. I will tell you that the number had more digits than anything I had previously associated with my own name. I will tell you that the stated acquisition value in the term sheet, which is a document I have read many times since, was $4.7 million for the technology and methodology, with a separate retention arrangement. I will tell you that I sat with Annette's voice on the phone for a moment before I said anything, and that what I said was, "What do you think?" Annette said she thought the methodology valuation was at the low end of a reasonable range given the retention data, and that she would push back on one clause in the retention terms, and that if I wanted to proceed, she could have a counterposition drafted by Friday. I told her to proceed. The counter came back accepted on the 2nd round. The term sheet was signed on a Thursday afternoon in Annette's office, which had a window that looked out onto a street I had walked down many times without ever having been inside the building. I called no one from the parking structure. I drove home, made dinner, and ate it at my kitchen table with a document open on my laptop that I was reviewing for the integration planning meeting scheduled for the following Monday. I told my parents 11 days later, on a Sunday, at the same kitchen table where my mother had handed my phone back, and called it a game. I had not planned the Sunday as a reveal. I want to be precise about this because it matters to me that you understand it correctly. I was not building toward a moment. I was not arranging the chairs for an effect. I had told Net and I had told Oren Blum, who had spent 6 months building the algorithm that was now part of the acquired technology and who received a payment from the acquisition proceeds, that I had insisted be written into the terms before I signed anything, and I had told one close friend. That was the complete list of people who knew before the Sunday. I told my parents on the Sunday because I had run out of a reasonable structural reason not to, and because the alternative, having them find out some other way, seemed worse. My mother was at the counter making coffee when I told her. She had her back to me for the first part of it, and she turned around at some point during the explanation, and by the time I had finished she was holding the coffee pot in one hand and not pouring anything. "How much?" she said. I told her the acquisition figure. Not the retention arrangement. The acquisition figure. She set the coffee pot down on the counter, without pouring it. My father, who had been reading at the table and had put his reading material face down at some point during my explanation, looked at the table surface for a moment. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the table again. "The engineers who came," he said, From the company. Yes. 3 of them. Yes. He nodded once, slowly, in the way he nodded when he was filing information into a category that required reorganization of an existing structure. It was the same nod he used when a technical specification came back different from what the initial survey had indicated. Not surprise exactly. Recalibration. My mother said, "You should have told us." I considered that for a moment. I'm telling you now. Before. When it was happening. I wasn't certain it would resolve the way it resolved. I didn't want to have a conversation about something that might not happen. She was quiet. The coffee pot was still on the counter unpoured. We could have. Mom. I said it gently. Not as a correction. As a closing. It's done. It went well. She picked up the coffee pot and poured 2 cups. She put one in front of my father and one at my usual seat across from him. Then she poured a third for herself and sat down. Annette Bouchard, my father said. He had apparently retained the name from my explanation. Is she specialized in technology transactions? Intellectual property and technology. Yes. He nodded again. Good. That was the extent of the conversation at the table that morning. We drank the coffee. My mother asked if I was hungry, and I said I could eat something, and she made eggs. We talked about Theo's upcoming thesis defense, and a repair my father had been managing on the back porch, and a film my mother had watched the previous week that she thought I would find interesting. It was an ordinary Sunday morning except for the fact that it wasn't, and the not ordinariness of it sat in the room with us without being named, the way certain things in families do. Theo called me 2 weeks after the Sunday from his apartment. Not a group call. His number, directly. He asked how the app thing had gone. He had apparently heard from his mother, who had heard from mine. The information had traveled in the way family information travels. Partial, slightly distorted, arriving at its destination in a different shape than it had left. I told him it had gone well. He was quiet for a moment. I laughed, he said. At the kitchen table. I remember. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was, he paused. I don't know what I thought. You were 22? I said. It's fine. It's not really fine. No, I agreed. But it's not unfixable. We talked for a while about his thesis, which was on load distribution in composite materials and which sounded, from his description, genuinely difficult. I asked 2 or 3 questions about it that were real questions, not polite ones. He answered them with the particular energy of someone who has not been asked real questions about their work recently. Before we hung up, he said, I'm going to use park hours for some of the data analysis I need to do for my defense. I told him the beta accounts had migrated to a Meridian integration program. I could get him access. He said he would actually use it, not just sign up. I know, I said. That's why I'm offering. The integration work took 14 months. Dr. Chandrasekharan's architecture team and I held a standing meeting every Tuesday at 2 p.m. for the first 8 months, which reduced to biweekly after the core gap mapping system had been embedded in Meridian's platform infrastructure. Felix Willet's API team rebuilt the integration layer 3 times before the 4th version held cleanly, which Felix said was normal and which I had no frame of reference to dispute. The first enterprise client to pilot the integrated diagnostic system was a logistics company with approximately 1,800 employees across 6 regional distribution centers. Their training completion rates under the old tier-N sequence model had been running at 44%. At the 12-week mark of the Parcours integrated pilot, the completion rate was 71%. Their training lead, a woman named Marguerite Desroches, sent Sebastian an email that he forwarded to me without comment, which I took as his version of a compliment. By the end of the retention period, the integrated system had been deployed to 11 enterprise clients. I had given 3 talks at industry conferences on adaptive learning architecture. I had been quoted in 2 trade publications. A journalist from a general interest technology magazine had written a profile piece that ran online and in print, a piece I had agreed to on the condition that the story focus on the methodology rather than the acquisition figure, a condition the journalist had honored without argument. My mother read the profile piece. She texted me. The journalist explained it well, better than I understood it before. I read the text twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket and went back to the meeting I had been in. I want to tell you what I kept from the 2 years that preceded the term sheet. Not the number. Not the methodology document or the signed agreement or the forwarded email from Marguerite Desroches, though I have all of those. What I kept was a note I had written to myself in the margin of a printed forum post, the post from the self-directed learning community that had first seeded the beta, the one that had been reshared more than I expected. I had printed it because I print things when I want to think about them carefully, a habit from the instructional design years. In the margin, in handwriting that was smaller than usual because I had been writing quickly, I had written, "They are using it because it works." That is the only evidence that matters right now. I had written that note 6 months before the kitchen table evening, 7 months before Sebastian Fortin's email, 14 months before Annette's call from the parking structure. I kept it because it was true before any of the rest of it was true. Not the acquisition, not the pilot results, not the trade publication quotes. The 400 beta users who came back on day 7 because the product had actually helped them, that was the evidence. The rest of it was the rest of it arriving in its own time. Some things announced themselves loudly, in the shape of 3 engineers on a Wednesday, and a meeting that goes 6 hours, and a term sheet signed in a lawyer's office with a view of a familiar street. And some things are quieter than that, a margin note, a retention rate, a user who comes back on day 7 because something worked that had not worked for them before. The loud version gets the headline. The quiet version is what the loud version was always built on. That is the thing I would have told my mother if telling her had been the point. It wasn't the point. The point was the work, and the work had been its own argument for 2 years before the argument was visible to anyone standing in the same room. The room will catch up. It always does. What you build in the hours when no one is watching is the only version of your work that belongs entirely to you, before the meeting, before the term sheet, before the profile piece. Before anyone at the table has adjusted their account of what they always believed. Hold that version. It is the truest one. I want to ask you something specific about this story. The moment my mother set down the coffee pot, not when she heard the number, not when I signed the term sheet, but the moment the coffee pot went back on the counter unpoured, was that the first time she saw the work, or was it the first time she allowed herself to see it? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. If you've ever kept building while someone at your table called it a game, subscribe. There's a new story every week, and the next one begins exactly the same way, with a room that hasn't caught up yet.